Diego Sanchez, a 45-year-old man, was alone in his luxurious penthouse on the Upper East Side of Malaga, gazing at the hazy horizon stretching before him. The towering skyscrapers around him seemed like empty mirrors, reflecting a life full of material success, but devoid of everything that truly mattered. As his eyes roamed over the urban landscape, a sense of emptiness overwhelmed him, a deep echo of loneliness that money could not silence. I have everything a man could desire, except what truly gives life meaning, he thought as his reflections grew somber. My name is etched in stone, but no one speaks it with love. No one speaks it with the kind of love that lasts for generations. The Italian phrase resonated in his mind. Un enfade moname, un figlio della mia anima, he whispered to himself, a son of his soul. Despite standing at the pinnacle of success, Diego felt an invisible weight, as though his soul was trapped within the walls of his own empire. Every signed contract, every growing bank account, was like a burnt-out star in the vast sky of his existence. Love, always unpredictable, always volatile, felt like a dangerous sea, and he avoided it at all costs. Yet what he desired most was not a wife or a lover, but a child who, even if not a reflection of his emotions, would carry on his legacy after he was gone. I've already had 2 failed marriages. I don't want another emotional failure, he murmured to himself, his voice cold as steel. His ex-wives had not loved him, but the sparkle of his wealth, the image he represented. Now, nothing mattered more to him than having an heir, someone to preserve his name, someone to continue his lineage without complications. The city of Barcelona enveloped him with its chaos and lights. Behind the wheel of his Lamborghini Diablo, navigating the congested streets near Central Park, Diego, lost in his thoughts, barely noticed the weary figure that appeared by his window. A young, homeless woman, with a pale face and disheveled hair, extended her hand with a mix of resignation and hope. Her piercing blue eyes bore into him, exposing something within him that even he could not comprehend. "Do you have something for me?" the young woman asked, her voice low but laced with a melancholic sweetness that surprised Diego. Irritable and unaccustomed to acknowledging vulnerability, he looked at her coldly. "Get lost," he snapped, speeding away as the light turned green. But something about her lingered in his mind. Those eyes. There was something in them that struck him in a place it shouldn't. Why does this matter to me, he wondered, as his Lamborghini roared through the city's hustle. An inexplicable urge to turn back gnawed at him, a discomfort he couldn't shake. Without knowing why, he turned the car at the next block and returned to where he had seen her. There she was, standing amidst the city's shadows, like a presence forgotten by the world. Without a second thought, he pulled the car over and lowered the window. "Get in," he ordered, his tone icy, distant, as though offering something trivial, something meaningless. The young woman looked at him with distrust, her eyes reflecting a hardened wisdom earned on the streets. "I'm not that kind of woman, if that's what you're after," she replied softly, holding his gaze. Diego raised an eyebrow, feeling a faint unease in his chest, but his face remained impassive. He hadn't expected someone like her to speak with such calmness, such resolve. "I'm not interested in women like you. I'm not looking for anything physical. You're safe with me, but stop talking nonsense and get in the car. Or do you prefer staying out here on the street, sleeping in the cold?" She hesitated for a moment, but Diego's blunt honesty intrigued her. Without a word, she climbed into the car, settling into the passenger seat. The silence between them was heavy as the Lamborghini's engine rumbled beneath the city that never slept. Diego glanced at her from the corner of his eye. The woman seemed a little over 28, but the weight of street life was etched into every line of her face. Finally, he broke the silence with the same coldness he used in all his dealings. "I'll make you an offer that will change your life," he said, his voice firm and calculating. "I want a child. Not a relationship, not a wife, just a child. I'll pay you a fortune and take care of you throughout the pregnancy." Jovana's mind seemed to freeze for an instant. Disbelief engulfed her as her thoughts spun like a whirlwind. "Is this real? What did he just say?" She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The word child seemed to strike her with an unexpected force, as if that word had never carried so much weight. Jovana Fernandez, a French immigrant who had come to Barcelona chasing a dream that had long since faded, couldn't understand what was happening.
"A child?"
she murmured, as if the word were a tangible burden.
"But you promised not to touch me."
"Of course," Diego replied without a hint of hesitation in his tone. "It will be through artificial insemination. What did you think? It couldn't be any other way. You know I don't even like you." Jovana remained silent, processing every word. The incessant noise of the city seemed to fade in her mind as chaos consumed her. She thought about how far she had fallen, how her dreams had shattered. She had arrived in the United States hoping to find a future, but soon realized that, like the sun obscured by clouds, her dream had vanished with each passing day. She had no family, no roots, and only loneliness accompanied her. Then, in her native language, Jovana whispered to herself, as if the words were her only solace. "La misère n'a pas de fin. Est-ce que c'est ma chance de m'échapper? Misery has no end. Is this my chance to escape?" But before she could even finish that thought, Diego interrupted.
"Do you think I don't know what you just said? I'm a cosmopolitan magnate, don't forget. You said, 'Misery has no end. Is this my chance to escape?'"
Jovana let out a heavy sigh, the kind born of the deepest resignation. She lowered her head as if carrying an invisible weight. Even so, she nodded, defeated. Diego looked at her coldly, like a man negotiating millions, unfazed, but something within him, perhaps a barely visible spark, began to change. It was as if the weight of his words and the stark truth before him affected him, but he wouldn't show it. "I'll ask you 2 questions, he said, his tone calculated, but with a trace of something he couldn't recognize. "What's your name, and what are you trying to escape from?"
"Jovana Fernandez,"
she replied, her voice trembling but holding a dignity she refused to lose. "I'm French. I came here 5 years ago, crossing the Atlantic with hopes of finding something better. I thought my sacrifice would be rewarded, that this country would welcome me with open arms. But the city has devoured me, taken everything I once was. Now I walk these streets, invisible, aimless." Diego watched her in silence. His gray eyes were like a cold mirror, but for a second, a flicker of something different crossed his gaze, as if he suddenly saw the woman before him not as a problem, but as a broken person. What hid behind those blue eyes, full of scars? A loneliness mirroring his own? He didn't know, but it unsettled him. Jovana continued, her gaze lost in memories that seemed ever more distant. "What am I trying to escape from?" she repeated, as if asking herself. "Everything. This broken life. The empty promises I made to myself. The streets seem to whisper my failures with every step. I just want to go back to my homeland, France. Sometimes I dream of its fields, the scent of chestnut trees, the rain on rooftops. But here, dreams come with a price too high to pay, and I don't have enough to buy my way back." The air between them grew heavy. Jovana's words, laden with suffering and desolation, pierced Diego's armor. For a second, he felt disarmed by the brutal truth she shared. This stranger stood before him, revealing a part of herself that neither he nor anyone else had wanted to see. Diego took a deep breath, regaining his composure. His gaze hardened again, and his voice returned to its usual coldness. "I understand," he said calmly. "Now I'll ask you one question, only once. Do you accept my proposal? Will you have my child and then leave? We'll set a significant amount for you to return to France and live comfortably there." Jovana looked at him, a mixture of resignation and relief reflected on her face. She thought about all the time she had fallen, every battle lost, but this proposal seemed like her only way out. Lowering her head, she closed her eyes for a moment, and after a sigh, she asked softly, but with a firmness she hadn't shown before, "Do I have another choice? I accept." Diego nodded, his expression unyielding. "We'll sign a contract. There are some clauses we need to agree on, but before that, I need your name, and I have another question. Why do you need a loveless surrogate when you have everything to charm someone of your own status?" Jovana's question caught him off guard. In a moment where Diego believed he had complete control of the situation, that simple question made him falter. The roar of his Lamborghini's engine still hummed beneath his hands, and the noise of the city seemed to disappear. For a moment, his gray eyes met her blue ones, and a mix of emotions crossed his face. Frustration, and perhaps a hint of vulnerability. But he wouldn't show it. With a calculated pause, Diego took a deep breath, as if preparing to announce an astronomical figure during a critical negotiation. His voice, cold and deliberate, broke the silence. "My name is Diego Sanchez, and you're right about one thing," he said unhurriedly, letting his words sink in. "I have everything a man could desire: power, money, influence. People respect me, or fear me. But love?" He paused, allowing the word to hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Love is nothing but a broken social contract, an empty promise, an agreement that is never honored. I've lived it. 2 marriages. Both ended in ashes because they never loved me. They only loved what I represented, the image, the fortune, the appearances." His gaze drifted momentarily, as though those memories had lodged themselves in his mind like a bitter taste. "Win someone's love at my level?" he repeated with a tone that was ironic, almost mocking. "I did it twice. And in both cases, I learned that love is just a transaction disguised as emotion. I have no interest in repeating it. I don't want a woman to stay with me just for what I can offer. I don't need the burden of empty promises or another sentimental failure. All I care about is my successor." His face hardened, regaining complete control of the situation, like a businessman who always dominates the markets, always wins. As if this deeply personal moment was just another simple deal to be closed. He leaned forward slightly, his voice colder but direct, like a warning. At that moment, the girl looked at him intently, her words slipping out with a sincerity he hadn't anticipated. "Your words are cold and calculating," she said with the frankness of someone who had seen much in life. "But I know there's something behind that, Diego. I see someone who doesn't just fear love, but desires it more than they're willing to admit. Loneliness disguises itself as strength, but in the end, it always reveals its true face." Diego didn't react, his expression remaining impassive. He turned his gaze forward and started the car, letting the engine's roar fill the space between them. Night was falling slowly as they drove toward the mansion, a place that seemed as disconnected from humanity as he was. When they arrived, Diego parked the car in the underground garage without saying a word. Jovana observed the enormous building, her face reflecting a mix of awe and disorientation. She hadn't seen luxury in years, and the contrast between her world and this one felt distant, almost unreal. She had crossed an invisible line, entering a universe she didn't know. Diego got out of the car, and as she followed, he paused for a moment. He observed her in silence, noting her worn clothes and fragile figure. For a brief instant, he was struck by the contrast between the immaculate Lamborghini and the woman battered by life who now occupied his existence. He made a small gesture with his hand, as if ordering a last-minute adjustment. "Come with me," he said directly. "The staff will provide whatever you need." They ascended in silence. The mansion was imposing, with white marble walls, grand staircases, and paintings by Renaissance artists Jovana had only seen in books. It wasn't a home. It was a museum that exuded wealth, but also desolation. The coldness of the place enveloped her, as if every corner had been designed to make loneliness feel even heavier. When they reached a spacious hall, Diego gave a brief, practical order to his assistant, Sofia, who appeared as soon as they entered. "Make her presentable, Sofia. Clothes, a bath, food, whatever is necessary, and keep the rest of the staff away." He didn't look at Sofia even once as he spoke, his tone purely functional, as if closing a business deal. The assistant nodded and, with a faint smile, invited Jovana to follow her to one of the guest rooms. "Come, I'll help you settle in," Sofia said kindly, a stark contrast to Diego's coldness. Jovana followed her in silence. She knew that what was beginning was only the start of an arrangement that would change her life forever. A couple of hours later, Diego was in his study, a majestic room filled with leather-bound books and overlooking Malaga's imposing skyline. Seated behind his dark wooden desk, he reviewed the documents before him as his lawyer, Emerick Suarez, calmly turned the pages. A knock on the door interrupted his concentration.
"Come in!"
Diego responded without taking his eyes off the papers. Sophia entered with a firm step, her hands clasped in front of her.
"Mr. Sanchez, did you call for me?" she asked softly.
Diego glanced up for only a moment. "Yes, Sophia, bring the young woman. Have her come down now."
"Right away, sir," Sophia replied, leaving the room with the same discretion she had entered.
Minutes passed, but the atmosphere in the study remained charged with a tense calm, as though something significant was about to happen. Both men remained silent, focused on their tasks, while awaiting the inevitable. A soft knock on the door interrupted the heavy silence in the room. Diego, without lifting his gaze from the documents in front of him, responded in his usual unshakable tone.
"Come in."
The door opened slowly, with a faint creak that seemed to fill the air with inexplicable anticipation. What happened in the next few seconds left both men in complete silence, stunned by the vision before them. Jovana appeared in the doorway, completely transformed. The woman who had once been a shadow of herself, exhausted and disheveled, now stood with unexpected elegance. Her hair, previously tangled, now cascaded in soft, shiny waves, as if it had captured sunlight in every strand. Her eyes, once mirrors of despair, now shone with a newfound clarity, like a sky cleared after a storm. Her posture, straighter than before, displayed a budding confidence, a change that seemed to have taken place in mere hours. She wore a simple, yet sophisticated outfit that highlighted her slender figure and lent her an unexpected grace with every step.
Emmerich, the lawyer, was momentarily speechless, staring at her as if hypnotized. He couldn't help himself. Jovana had become an absolutely stunning woman.
"Miss Beaulieu," he said, his voice almost wavering, as though he couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing, "you are simply dazzling." Jovana, who had been looking at the floor in silence, lifted her gaze upon hearing the compliment. A slight blush crept onto her cheeks, catching her by surprise. She hadn't expected such praise, but she quickly recovered, straightening her posture and regaining control. Diego, for his part, felt an uncomfortable pang in his stomach, a chill running through his body. It was an emotion he didn't want to acknowledge, a flicker of jealousy that surfaced without warning. His gaze shifted to Emmerich, trying to mask any sign of discomfort. "Very well," he said, breaking the moment with a voice firmer than necessary. "We will proceed to review the contract clauses for signing." The cold authority in his tone left no room for further distractions. Jovana stepped forward, the echo of her heels resonating in the office's emptiness as tension filled the room. The contract was signed in heavy silence, the atmosphere dense as if the fate of everyone present had been sealed by that simple agreement. The next morning, Diego woke early, as usual, but this time, something inside him had shifted. The dawn in Malaga painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and sunlight filtered through the mansion's enormous windows. As the city began to awaken, Diego couldn't stop thinking about the contract they had just signed. With a growing sense of unease, he walked through the house to the wing where Jovana slept. His footsteps echoed in the mansion's silence, and upon reaching her door, he knocked softly before opening it with the same cold determination that always characterized him.
"We're leaving immediately," he said, his voice sharp, leaving no room for doubt.
Jovana, still half asleep, looked at him in confusion, trying to understand what was happening. "Where are we going?" she asked, slowly rising from the bed as sunlight bathed the room, creating a warmth that contrasted with Diego's icy words.
"To fulfill the first clause of the contract," he replied quickly, his tone allowing no objections.
Within minutes, they were in Diego's Lamborghini Diablo driving through the city streets. The engine roared powerfully, and although the car's exterior remained the same as always, the tension inside was palpable. Diego, unflinching, kept his eyes fixed on the road, while Jovana stared out the window, lost in thought. Many words swirled in her mind, but none managed to escape her lips. Sometimes the silence between two people can be louder than any words. The car finally stopped in front of the most exclusive fertility clinic in the city, a place that, like everything in Diego's life, seemed to radiate luxury and perfection. The discreet silver sign was a symbol of exclusivity, instantly recognizable to anyone from New York's elite. Jovana, stepping out of the car, lifted her gaze to the imposing building. In that moment, something ignited within her, a thought that went beyond the contract, beyond any written obligation. Bringing a life into the world is never an empty act, no matter how it begins. While this being grows within me, it will be loved. This isn't just an agreement. It's the creation of something deeper, something that neither fate nor a contract can take away from me. Diego walked beside her in silence, unaware of the storm of emotions brewing inside her. They crossed the clinic's automatic doors, a place that, with its immaculate whiteness, seemed to erase any trace of doubt or regret. It was as if the luxury and cleanliness of the clinic were trying to mask the complexity of what they were about to experience. Yet, in Jovana's heart, the questions and emotions continued to pile up, unanswered. The steps taken with resignation are the heaviest. For the soul never stops seeking its voice, even when silence seems to be the only thing heard. The doctor explained the procedure with an almost mechanical coldness, devoid of embellishment or emotion. Every word he spoke was perfectly measured, calculated, as if they themselves were part of a contract where science was the sole authority. Jovana, mute, nodded to everything. Without uttering a single word, she agreed to all that was asked of her. Acceptance is not always surrender, but there are moments when acceptance feels like the only possible way out. The process would be quick, but not instantaneous. Tests, consultations, medical examinations to ensure everything was in order, each step meticulously carried out. In the days that followed, visits to the clinic became routine. With each visit, the weight of the contract grew more palpable. It hung in the air between them, invisible yet inescapable, like a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. Some agreements go beyond signed papers. It's the pacts we make with ourselves that truly define us. Jovana, though silent, understood that this contract was not just an agreement with Diego, but an emotional responsibility far greater than any clause could encompass. What life demands of us isn't always written in ink. Sometimes the most significant burdens are those we impose on ourselves without anyone asking us to. Finally, the day of the insemination arrived. Like everything Diego had planned, the procedure was cold, clinical, stripped of all emotion. The sterile and controlled environment only reaffirmed the calculated nature of their agreement. But for Jovana, the coldness of the clinic could not extinguish the warmth beginning to ignite within her. As the doctors performed their work with relentless precision, her mind and heart were set on the future that was beginning to take shape. Within her, she felt that what was happening was not merely a medical procedure, it was a sacred act. While she gazed at the white ceiling of the clinic, her thoughts wandered to the future, to the being that was starting to grow inside her. She felt a lump in her throat and closed her eyes, trying to calm the emotion that overwhelmed her. This is not just a contract, she thought. This is a life, a being I will love with all my heart, even if it was born out of this agreement. Jovana placed her hand on her belly, feeling the life beginning to form within her. It wasn't a contract that bound her to this being, but a bond already being forged, one initiated by life itself. On the way home, the silence in the car was dense, almost unbearable. Jovana stared out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of lights and shadows. Finally, Diego broke the silence, but his words were as cold as ever. "This was just the first step. Now we just have to wait," he said in the same empty tone he always used, as if what they had just done was merely another transaction in his calculated life. Jovana glanced at him sideways, feeling a deep unease. His words unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite understand. He spoke of waiting as though what they had just done was no more than paperwork, just another task. Something in Diego was beginning to crack, something he wasn't willing to admit. "Diego," she said with profound calm, her words carrying the weight of an undeniable truth. "Children are not just the result of a desire or a rational plan. They are the reflection of our soul, the mark of who we are when we are no longer here to tell our story. Today, we have done more than fulfill a clause. We have ignited a flame that no contract can extinguish, a flame that knows nothing of wealth or agreements, only of life." Diego, who until that moment had maintained his impenetrable facade, felt her words pierce him, leaving a mark he could not ignore. A chill ran through his body, an unfamiliar, forgotten sensation. Jovana had just touched upon a truth he had never dared to face. Her words were like an invisible dagger, cutting him without mercy. He looked at her, his eyes, normally cold and dark, now reflecting an emotion he had never acknowledged in himself. "What do you know about the soul?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, betraying a vulnerability he had never shown. Jovana did not look away. She held his gaze with the firmness of someone who had learned to live on the edge of life itself.
The soul has no price, Diego. Neither contracts nor wealth can own it. Love, whether you deny it or not, will always find its way. It will seep into the things you think you control.
Jovana's words echoed within Diego like a sound he couldn't silence. A strange sensation, like a tremor, overtook him, sending shivers down his spine. For the first time in years, Diego Sanchez found himself in absolute silence, as if life itself had ceased offering him clear answers. The man who had always directed every step of his existence with surgical precision, accustomed to controlling everything, now found himself powerless before a truth he could not negotiate. After the insemination, their interactions had been limited to the strictly necessary. Both maintained an invisible distance, but within them beat a shared awareness. Something far greater than a contract, than an agreement, was in motion. Life, like an endless river, flowed toward its uncertain destination, beyond anything either of them could foresee. Destiny is like a current that sweeps us along, but we can never truly know its direction. The car moved toward the fertility clinic in New York, but the air inside the vehicle was heavy, as if the words they were about to hear could change the course of their lives forever. Diego drove with his usual composure, his face impassive, but inside, a mix of nervousness and something unfamiliar swirled, a sensation he couldn't quite understand. Jovana, sitting beside him, gazed out the window. Outwardly calm, inside she wrestled with a storm of emotions fighting to surface. She knew this day would mark a before and an after. It wasn't just a medical consultation. It was a crossroads between the mundane and the transcendent. The answers we seek don't always come in words. Sometimes they're found in the silences. The medical team greeted them calmly, their professional serenity a stark contrast to the uncertainty they felt. A sign on the wall read, "Creation is always a divine act, a sigh of the universe, unannounced." The gynecologist, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, offered them a slight smile before guiding them into a private room. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Sanchez," he said gently. "Today, we'll find out if the insemination was successful." As they walked toward the exam room, Jovana's heart pounded. She knew something profound was about to happen, an irrevocable change. This wasn't just a consultation, but the threshold of something that could never be undone. In an unexpected gesture, Diego took her hand, squeezing it gently, uncharacteristically so. Looking at her, he asked, "Are you nervous? We're about to discover our fate." Jovana, with a deep serenity, met his gaze and replied in a voice that seemed to come from her soul. "When the heart hears existence blossoming, it cannot help but beat faster, for it recognizes its own echo in every new life." Her words left Diego pensive, astonished by their depth. For the first time, he felt there was something beyond what he had planned and calculated. The doctor invited them to sit, and the procedure began. Diego stood nearby, observing with his typical detachment, but his eyes, rarely looking beyond the tangible, were now fixed on something much greater, creation itself, life unfolding. Jovana reclined, her body tense, but her mind calm, waiting. The gynecologist prepared the ultrasound machine, and a profound silence filled the room. Diego didn't take his eyes off the screen, where what had once been merely an agreement on paper was now becoming tangible, real. The doctor applied cold gel to Jovana's abdomen, and the transducer began to move. Blurry black and white images appeared on the screen, followed by the unmistakable sound of heartbeats. Everyone held their breath. The gynecologist studied the screen for a moment before smiling. "Life doesn't announce itself with grand fanfare," he said. "It reveals itself in the simple, eternal rhythm of a beating heart." After a pause, the doctor exclaimed, "Here it is," he said, pointing to the screen. "Everything seems to be progressing as expected, but there's something else you should know." Diego leaned forward, his curiosity evident. Jovana glanced at him with a subtle expression, sensing the tension in his body. "What is it, doctor?" Diego asked, his tone less cold than usual. The doctor smiled slightly and pointed to several small figures on the screen. "There isn't just one heartbeat, "There are 3, he said, a smile spreading across his face. "Congratulations, you're expecting triplets."
Time seemed to stand still. 3 heartbeats, 3 lives. A shiver ran through Jovana's body, and her eyes filled with tears, tears of happiness she couldn't fully comprehend. 3 tiny hearts beat in unison within her.
For the first time in a long while, Diego felt a profound joy, an unexpected emotion. Gently, he placed a soft kiss on Jovana's forehead as she caressed her abdomen, lost in the moment.
Love isn't measured by contracts or agreements. It multiplies, overflows, and takes shapes that no meticulously planned destiny could foresee.
Diego, having returned to his place by the door, looked at her again, this time with a more open expression, as if something within him was finally beginning to melt. For the first time in his life, Diego Sanchez realized that the woman before him was not just the vessel for the arrival of his heir, but that, in some way, she shared with him the greatest miracle of existence. Jovana, with her eyes fixed on the horizon from the terrace, bathed in the golden light of the sunset, seemed to convey with her being the calm that only a peaceful heart can offer in a world that never stops. On her face, which showed the first signs of her pregnancy, Diego saw something he did not expect, a fragility he had never perceived in her before. She had always been the unshakable rock, the strong woman with whom he had made a calculated and distant agreement, but now, something had changed. Jovana placed a hand on her temple and closed her eyes for a moment, a gesture that made it clear she was being overcome by a fatigue she could not hide. Diego, who had always been the man of calculated action, paused for a moment, bewildered by his own reaction. Instead of standing idly by as usual, something within him pushed him toward her as if it were instinctive. He walked toward the terrace with determined steps, but when he reached her side, his voice sounded different, softer than usual, though still retaining that distance he could never quite shed.
"Are you all right?"
he asked, not knowing if his words carried enough weight to make her feel better. Jovana slowly opened her eyes, surprising him with her calm as she weakly smiled at him. "Just a bit dizzy. I suppose it's normal," she said with a smile that tried to downplay the incident. Diego stayed there, a moment too long for his own taste, unsure how to act. In any other case, he would have called Sophia or another member of the staff, but this time something made him act differently. Without thinking, he leaned toward her, and with unusual tenderness, he lifted her into his arms. Jovana looked at him, her eyes wide open, surprised. "It's not necessary. I can walk," she said with a humility he didn't expect him to see. But Diego, without hesitation, responded with a firmness that was not without a softness unfamiliar to him. "No, let me carry you." The journey to the room was silent, but in that silence were more unspoken words than any conversation they could have had. Diego felt the heartbeat of life in every step he took, as if his own heart shared the burden of what was to come. When they reached the door of the room, something in the air changed. As he pushed it open with his foot and crossed the threshold, Diego felt Jovana's body tense slightly in his arms. She lifted her gaze, astonished, seeing the radical change in the room. Every corner was imbued with the echo of a new life being conceived. The fragrance of fresh flowers filled the air, and a giant stuffed animal on the dresser completed the atmosphere, creating a space that now seemed like a sanctuary for the triplets growing inside her. What is this?" Jovana whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around, disbelief in her eyes. Diego, who until that moment had maintained his usual composure, let slip a small spark of vulnerability. "I wanted you to feel more comfortable. I thought you'd like it," he said, his tone slower and filled with doubts, as if he himself was questioning whether he had done the right thing. Jovana could do nothing but be completely surprised by the gesture, still stunned by the tenderness that filled every corner of the room. "No, I didn't expect something like this," she replied, still processing the meaning of the change. Diego gently laid her on the bed and sat on the edge, watching her. As she continued to scan every detail with her eyes, the silence that had fallen between them was profound, but also filled with something more. Diego, almost without realizing it, let words escape that he never imagined he would say. "I thought a life that begins deserves a space full of light, a place where love can find its home," he said, even surprising himself with the softness of his voice.
Jovana looked at him with an intensity that made him shiver. And then, with a tenderness that bordered on poetry, she said, "L'amour ne demande rien en retour, mais il change tout. La más dura de las almas acaba dejándose moldear por él." The air between them tightened, and Diego looked away, unable to hold the strength of her words. Something inside him, something that had been sealed for years, began to crack. The silence that enveloped them was no longer an abyss. This time, it was filled with a closeness neither of them had anticipated. Diego, for the first time, allowed himself to feel, even if just a flicker, the warmth of love beginning to seep through the cracks in his armor. Diego's hand remained intertwined with Jovana's, and while the soft afternoon wind caressed the curtains of the open windows, both of them knew they were walking down a path that would take them far beyond what they had ever imagined. Diego woke up early that morning, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. In recent weeks, the relationship he had forged with Jovana had stopped being just a contract, something he initially considered a simple obligation. Little by little, without even realizing it, he had begun to look out for her, to worry about her, with a devotion that he didn't fully understand himself. But today, something was different. Today, everything would change. The mansion, with its usual grandeur, seemed wrapped in a strange silence. The walls, which often resonated with the coldness of their own existence, now stood still, as if time itself had decided to stop, to make way for what was coming. The three lives inside Jovana were reaching their most crucial moment. Diego walked down the hallway, each step heavy with the awareness that today would mark a before and after. He stopped in front of the door to his room, and just as he was about to turn the handle, he heard Jovana's voice, soft, filled with emotion and nervousness.
"Diego, I think it's time," she whispered, her eyes reflecting a mixture of anxiety and hope as she looked at him from the doorframe. Despite the fatigue on her face, there was an inner light that illuminated her.
Diego's heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, he quickly approached and helped her stand, guiding her wordlessly toward the car. The road, empty and silent, could barely compete with the frantic beating of their hearts. The roar of the Lamborghini Diablo's engine sounded distant, almost as if it didn't exist in that moment. Jovana, with a protective hand on her belly, glanced at Diego from the corner of her eye, noticing in his gaze that something had changed in him. What once was a strictly contractual relationship now seemed to be something deeper, something more real. "I'll be with you the whole time," Diego told her with a gentleness he had never shown, but with a determination that was impossible to ignore. There was nothing, no one, that could separate them now. "Thank you, Diego," Jovana murmured, her voice full of gratitude and contained emotion. The drive to the hospital passed quickly, and when they arrived, the medical team was ready to receive them. Jovana was taken directly to the delivery room, and Diego, without letting go of her hand, followed her. Time seemed to stop as the contractions intensified. Each of her breaths, each squeeze of her hand was a tangible manifestation of the internal struggle they were both living through. The battle against the pain, but also against the reality that was approaching, 3 lives about to enter the world. The hours seemed to stretch until finally, the first cry broke the air. A boy. Diego's heart stopped for a second, and a lump formed in his throat. The second cry soon followed, another boy. And then, the third cry. A girl. 3 lives, 3 destinies. The plan he had worked so hard on now seemed nothing compared to the magnificence of that moment. "They're perfect," Jovana whispered, exhausted but radiant, as her tears fell onto the faces of her children. With trembling hands, she caressed their small faces. It was a love so deep, she couldn't have anticipated. A love that consumed her completely. Diego, deeply moved by what he was seeing, could not take his eyes off the tiny bodies lying in the nurse's arms. For the first time, he experienced what it was like to be connected to something he could neither buy nor control, something that was pure life. But then, amid the happiness that filled the room, Diego noticed that Jovana's tears were not just of joy. They were tears mixed with immense pain that he was just beginning to understand. She was crying for what she would have to do, for what the future would impose on her. The unbreakable clause of the contract. Soon, she would have to part from those little beings she already loved with all her heart. Diego, she whispered through sobs. I don't want to leave them. But this was our deal, and I'll keep it, even if it breaks my soul.
Each word Jovana said seemed to break something else inside him. The happiness that had once filled him now mingled with the cold reality of what they had agreed upon, the terms of the contract, the clauses that bound them. Everything seemed irrelevant in the face of the suffering of this woman who had transformed him more than he could understand.
Without saying a word, Diego leaned in and kissed her forehead, feeling a pressure in his chest that he had never experienced. He knew something inside him had changed forever. Like Jovana, he could no longer ignore what truly mattered. Jovana once again caressed her daughter's face as tears continued to fall relentlessly. In that instant, she understood that love, though born of a contract, was much stronger than any agreement made on paper. Jovana didn't know how she would face what was to come. But for now, all she could do was cry, clinging to that fleeting moment, to those tiny beings she had just brought into the world, and who soon, in one way or another, would no longer be hers. As the tears ran down her cheeks, Diego remained silent, watching her pain with a feeling of helplessness that pierced him completely. He knew something had to change, that it couldn't just end like this, but he had no idea how to take the first step. The day after the birth, the morning light timidly filtered through the hospital curtains, bathing the room in an almost unreal softness. Jovana rested after an exhausting night, but her face showed a serenity that, despite her fatigue, radiated an indescribable satisfaction. She had brought 3 lives into the world. Diego, however, was far from his usual coldness. He spent the night in a chair beside her, watching her breath and the calm rhythm of her sleep. He couldn't help it. There was something about Jovana's vulnerability that broke him inside. Her exhaustion, the sweetness emanating from her face, moved him in ways he couldn't understand. At dawn, Diego decided to let her rest a little longer. He quietly left the room, making sure not to make any noise to avoid waking her. He needed to get out, get some air, and maybe, if he was lucky, find something for breakfast for her, something that could comfort her. When he returned to the hospital, he walked with steady steps down the hall, but when he reached the door of the room, something inside him stopped him. The door was slightly ajar, and from there, he could see that the space had changed. It wasn't just full of flowers, of all kinds, colors, and sizes, but in the chair where he had spent the night, now sat Emerick Suarez, his trusted lawyer. Something twisted in his stomach with a strange feeling of discomfort. He stood there, still, not daring to enter. Emerick was leaning toward Jovana, speaking softly, but what Diego heard made his heart stop. "Jovana, I know all of this has been very fast, and maybe what I'm going to say will surprise you," Emerick said with a softness in his tone that Diego had never heard from him. "But since I met you, something has changed in me. You seem like an incredible woman." Diego watched as, with unexpected tenderness, Emerick took Jovana's hand. She looked at him in surprise, a mixture of astonishment and bewilderment painted on her face.
"What I feel is sincere, Jovana. I want to be by your side. I want to ask you for something more. I want to offer you something different. I don't want this to just be another chapter in your life. I want you to give me the opportunity to care for you, to offer you a home, and for you to have the children you want, whenever you want, with no contracts, no clauses." Emerick's words, filled with a sincerity Diego had never imagined, left him frozen. But what happened next was what truly broke him.
Jovana Fernandez, Emerick said, showing her a ring with an air of absolute confidence. Would you marry me?
Diego's world turned upside down, and unable to contain himself any longer, he pushed the door open forcefully. The sound of it opening was like an explosion in the air, making Emerick release Jovana's hand and turn toward him, maintaining his composure but with a smile trying to mask the tension of the moment.
Diego, said Emerick, without losing his calm, I didn't expect to see you so soon.
Diego moved toward the bed, his face impassive, but in his eyes there was a storm that no one could ignore. He looked at Jovana, as surprised as he was, and then at the flowers, those bouquets that hadn't been there when he left. "Emerick," said Diego, his voice cold, laced with suppressed anger. "The flowers? Are they yours, right?" Emerick nodded with a smile.
I thought Jovana would be happy to have some color in the room. She deserves to be surrounded by beauty.
"Don't you think so, Diego?"
he added with a tone that didn't go unnoticed. The air instantly tensed. Diego felt as if something inside him had broken, a mix of jealousy and confusion that made him feel vulnerable in a way he had never experienced. "I see you're offering her something more," Diego said, his voice sharp as a dagger. "Marriage, Emmerich? Here, in the hospital, right after she gives birth?"
Emmerich slowly got up from the chair, calmly, not letting Diego's provocation affect him.
"Yes, Diego," he said without hesitation. "I've offered her something real, something beyond contracts. I believe she needs someone who isn't with her for an agreement, but because they truly care."
Diego clenched his fists tightly, struggling against an internal storm that left him completely overwhelmed.
I had never felt such deep vulnerability, a complete loss of control. All this time, I had believed everything was under my command. Perfectly calculated. I, Diego, was the only one who decided the fate of Jovana and the children. But now, with a strange feeling that ran through me from the very depths of my being, I realized it wasn't that way. Emmerich had barged into the scene, and there was something more than just a professional or legal interest.
"I don't think this is the right time to impose emotional decisions on someone who has just gone through what Jovana has lived through," said Diego, trying to maintain his firm tone, though his voice trembled slightly.
"You're right, Diego," answered Emmerich, with a calmness that contrasted with the palpable tension in the room. "This isn't the time to push, but neither is it the time to ignore what I feel. I can't pretend there's nothing real between us."
Jovana, who had been silent, looked at both of them with an expression of disbelief and exhaustion. She was drained, confused, and the last thing she needed was for two men to get entangled in a power struggle in her hospital room.
"Emmerich."
"Diego," she whispered, bringing a hand to her forehead as if trying to stop the emotional storm surrounding her. "Please, not now. I just need to rest." Both men looked at each other, aware that the situation had gotten out of hand. Emmerich looked at her one last time before heading toward the door, softly murmuring, "Rest, Jovana. I'll be here if you need me." Diego stood in silence, next to the bed, not knowing what to say. The weight of silence filled the room, but inside him, something else was taking shape, something neither of them was prepared to face. Slowly, Diego sat in the empty chair next to the bed. He watched Jovana as she closed her eyes, trying to find comfort in sleep. But as he looked at her, an undeniable truth began to settle in his mind. This was no longer just a contract, and that terrified him. 3 months had passed since the birth of the triplets, 3 months in which Diego had experienced a deep love for those little ones, but also an unbearable sadness knowing that soon, according to the terms of the contract, he would have to part with them. The day he had to leave the mansion, the day he had to leave Jovana and his children, was quickly approaching. In her room, surrounded by the memories of her children, Jovana packed her few belongings. The suitcase was almost empty, containing only the essentials. She didn't care about the money Diego had promised her. She didn't want any of it. As she closed the suitcase, the pain in her heart was unbearable. Tears flowed ceaselessly as she held her 3 little ones in her arms, kissing their faces, knowing it would be the last time she would see them. The triplets, unaware of everything, slept peacefully in their cribs. Jovana watched them, memorizing every little detail of them. Their angelic faces, their little fingers, their soft breathing. She remembered why she had signed the contract, the hope for a better future, but she never imagined that this very contract would rip her soul away. What a deep pain. She loved those children with every fiber of her being, and although she didn't want to admit it, she also loved him, Diego. She descended the mansion stairs slowly, dragging the suitcase behind her. Each step was an echo of farewell in the empty hallway, as the grandeur of the mansion felt cold and indifferent to her. The house that had once been her refuge now only reminded her of the impending pain. And just as she was about to leave, with the door in her hand, a deep voice interrupted her, tearing the silence like thunder. "Jovana, where are you going?" It was Diego. His voice echoed throughout the mansion. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "It's because of Emmerich Suarez, isn't it?" Diego continued, approaching. "Is it because you've fallen in love with him?" Jovana tightly closed her eyes, anger and sadness converging inside her. She took a deep breath, tried to calm herself before slowly turning toward him, her face flooded with tears. "Don't you understand anything?" she exclaimed, desperation and frustration in her voice. It's not about Emmerich. Do you remember the last clause of your contract? I was supposed to leave 90 days after the birth. That's what we signed, Diego.
Diego stood in front of her, breathing heavily. In his eyes, there was something more than worry. There was fear of losing her.
Without saying anything, he put his hand in his pocket and took out the contract. The same contract that had set the course of their lives from the beginning. The contract that coldly and calculatingly bound them together. With a decisive gesture, Diego held the contract in front of her. However, instead of following the expected protocol, he did something completely unexpected. With a mix of fury and contained desperation, he tore the contract piece by piece, letting the fragments fall to the ground as if each piece represented a part of his soul that no longer wanted to be chained to that paper.
Jovana watched him silently, her eyes wide in shock, unable to understand what was happening. "Forgive me, Jovana," Diego said, his voice breaking as he fell to his knees before her, in an act of vulnerability she could never have imagined. "Do you know what I've learned from you? Do you remember when I told you I couldn't love anyone else because the women I loved before destroyed me? Well, you, unintentionally, have taught me to trust in love again." Jovana stared at him, completely stunned. Diego's words didn't seem real, as if everything she had believed up until that moment was crumbling in front of her.
"It's crazy to hate all roses because one thorn pricked you," he continued, his eyes filled with emotion and regret. "I don't want you to leave. I don't care what the contract says. I don't care about the agreement we made. The only thing I want is for you to stay with our children, to stay with me. Even if you love Emmerich or anyone else, stay for them, stay for the triplets."
Jovana, who until that moment had been marked by pain and confusion, felt a wave of conflicting emotions upon seeing Diego in such a vulnerable state. She had never seen him like this, never seen him kneel before anyone, never seen him lose control of the situation. And now, here he was, begging. She looked at him for several long seconds, her eyes filled with tears that fell incessantly. With a softness that contrasted with the storm inside her, she raised a hand and placed it on his head, a gesture that had been hers alone until that moment.
"Loving Emmerich Suarez," Jovana murmured with a bitter laugh as her tears mingled with something she couldn't fully define. "How can you be so foolish?" Her voice cracked as she gently stroked his hair. "It's you I love, from the very first day I saw you."
Diego looked up, incredulous, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Jovana, through her tears, continued, her smile emerging amid the crying. "It was always you, since you rescued me from the street, since our lives crossed in such a strange way, even though I never wanted to admit it, even though you always hid me behind the clauses of a contract. My heart has always been yours."
Jovana's words echoed in his mind like a reverberation, unsettling everything he had believed up until that moment. What had started as a simple deal, a cold transaction, had now transformed into something much bigger, much deeper, something he could no longer ignore. "Jovana," he whispered, taking her hand in his with a newfound strength. "I love you too. I've loved you all this time, even though I denied it. I ask you to stay. Not for the kids, not for the contract, but for us. I want us to be a family. I want us to share our lives. Will you honor me by being my wife? By being my one true love?" Jovana looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. Without thinking any further, she threw herself into his arms, dropping the suitcase she had been carrying. Diego, with his heart overflowing with happiness, enveloped her in a deep embrace, one he had longed for. "I love you, Diego," she whispered between sobs. Diego held her even tighter, and as he cradled her in his arms, he leaned in, sealing his words with a passionate kiss, full of everything that had been left unsaid during so many months of inner struggle. Months later, the mansion, once cold and empty, now vibrated with life and joy. Diego and Jovana's wedding was an intimate celebration, filled with love, forgiveness, and a new beginning. And in their arms, the triplets, the living proof that what had started as an impersonal contract had blossomed into something much greater. A family. In the end, Diego had found what he had been searching for, something bigger than himself. And as he looked at his wife and children, he knew that he hadn't just signed an agreement to secure an heir. He had unknowingly signed a pact with love.